My stepmother stood up at Christmas dinner, lifted her wine glass, and announced that my grandfather's car finally had a proper owner. The room laughed politely. My father smiled into his mashed potatoes. My younger stepsister Lily looked down at the table and tried to act surprised badly enough that she almost started grinning. Then Sandra reached into her purse, pulled out a red bow, and slid it across the table toward Lily. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart," she said. "Grandpa's Mustang is yours now." For a moment nobody moved. Even the television in the living room seemed quieter. Snow tapped softly against the dining room window, while 23 members of my family stared at the bow sitting beside the gravy boat like it belonged there. I looked at my father first. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Instead, he adjusted his glasses and focused very hard on cutting his ham. That was all the answer I needed. He knew. Sandra smiled at me the way people smile when they're waiting for a tantrum. "You don't mind, do you, Emma?" she asked. "Lily needs it more than you do. And besides, you live in Chicago now." Lily finally picked up the bow and laughed nervously. "I mean, if you're okay with it, obviously." I looked around the table. Aunt Rebecca was staring into her drink. Uncle Joe suddenly became fascinated by the dinner rolls. My cousin Tyler kept switching his eyes between me and the window, as if hoping to teleport somewhere else. Nobody said a word. Nobody reminded Sandra that the car wasn't hers. Nobody reminded her that my grandfather had left it to me by name in his will 6 months earlier. A 1968 Mustang Fastback. Deep blue with white racing stripes and a tiny scratch near the left headlight from the day I learned how to park it when I was 16. Grandpa called the scratch our signature. He refused to fix it, said every good car deserved a story. "Emma?" Sandra asked again. "You're awfully quiet." I picked up my glass, took a sip of water, then I smiled. I actually smiled. "Of course," I said. "If that's what everyone wants." Sandra blinked. That wasn't the reaction she expected. Lily blinked too. My father finally looked up from his plate. "You're taking this very well," Sandra said carefully. I shrugged. "It's Christmas." The room relaxed immediately. You could almost hear it happen. Chairs shifted. Someone laughed. Forks started moving again. The crisis had passed. The difficult daughter wasn't going to ruin dinner. Sandra squeezed Lily's shoulder proudly. "Family should share blessings," she announced to the table, like she'd just solved world hunger. I even clapped when Lily stood up and hugged her. 3 quick claps. Smile still on my face. My cousin Tyler stared at me like I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. Grandpa died in June. Lung cancer. 8 months from diagnosis to funeral. During those 8 months, I flew from Chicago to Ohio 11 times. 11 flights. 22 airports. Countless hospital rooms. I learned how to refill oxygen tanks. I learned how to make hospital coffee taste almost drinkable. I learned how to sleep in plastic waiting room chairs without waking up, unable to move my neck. Sandra visited him twice. Lily visited once and spent most of the visit scrolling through social media in the corner of his room. Grandpa noticed everything even near the end. Especially near the end. 3 weeks before he died, he handed me a small brass key attached to an old leather keychain. "The Mustang stays with you, kiddo," he told me. "Cars remember who loves them." I laughed, because it sounded exactly like something Grandpa would say. "That's not legally recognized wisdom, you know." "Should be," he pointed a finger at me. "Don't let anyone guilt you out of it after I'm gone. People get funny when inheritance shows up." I promised him I wouldn't. At the time, I thought he meant distant cousins or lawyers or paperwork problems. I never imagined he meant Christmas dinner 6 months later, with turkey getting cold beside the cranberry sauce, while my stepmother wrapped my inheritance in a red bow and handed it to someone else. Lily was already talking about paint colors now. "I might go matte black," she said excitedly. "Or maybe wrap it in silver." Grandpa would have fainted. Sandra laughed. "You'll make it your own." My own smile never moved. "You should post pictures when you do it." My father looked up sharply at that. Something in my voice must have worried him. "Emma," he started. I shook my head gently. "It's fine, Dad." It wasn't fine. Not even close. But there are moments in life when anger is expensive and silence is free. This was one of those moments. Dinner ended an hour later. People gathered coats and leftovers, and children and excuses. Snow covered the driveway outside in perfect white sheets. The Mustang sat under the streetlight near the garage, exactly where Grandpa always parked it when he visited us growing up. Blue paint, white stripes, That same tiny scratch near the headlight. Lily walked outside and stood beside it, holding the red bow in both hands, while Sandra took pictures with her phone. "Smile bigger," Sandra said. "This is a special moment." I stood on the porch, watching them. My breath turned white in the air. My father stepped beside me. "You know how Sandra gets." I laughed quietly. "Yeah, Dad, I know exactly how Sandra gets." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Maybe this is easier for everyone." Easier for everyone. Not fair. Not right. Easier. Funny how often families confuse those words. I walked down the steps and stopped beside the Mustang. My hand brushed against the cold metal roof. For a second, I could hear Grandpa laughing beside me. Could smell engine oil and peppermint candy, and old leather seats warming in summer sunlight. Cars remember who loves them. I turned toward Lily and smiled again. "Take good care of her," I said. Lily nodded happily. Sandra wrapped an arm around her shoulders and looked at me with victory written all over her face. I wished them both a Merry Christmas. Then I got in my rental car and drove back to my hotel through falling snow, with my phone lighting up beside me from relatives telling me how mature I was being, how graceful, how understanding. They all thought the story was over. They thought I had accepted losing Grandpa's car. They thought Christmas dinner had settled everything. What none of them understood was that the title was still in my name. And on December 29th, while my family was planning New Year's dinner and Lily was shopping for seat covers online, I sold the Mustang for $72,000 cash and disappeared before the snow had melted. The first phone call came 12 minutes after I crossed into Pennsylvania. I looked at the screen glowing on the dashboard. "Dad." I let it ring until voicemail answered for me. 30 seconds later, Sandra called. Then Lily. Then Dad again. By the time I reached my hotel outside Pittsburgh, there were 11 missed calls and 4 voicemails waiting for me. I listened to none of them. Instead, I sat on the edge of the hotel bed, staring at the snow outside the window, and thinking about my grandfather's hands. They always looked too big for whatever they were holding. Coffee cups looked small in them. Screwdrivers disappeared completely. Even hospital paperwork looked like children's homework when he signed it near the end. The Mustang looked right in those hands, though. Some things simply belong together. Grandpa bought the car in 1972 from a mechanic outside Columbus who needed money fast after a divorce. 4 years old, 8,000 miles. Blue paint already fading under the Ohio sun. Grandpa drove 3 hours with cash in his pocket and came home with what he called the only irresponsible purchase of his entire life. Grandma hated it immediately, said it was loud and impractical, and attracted speeding tickets like magnets attracted nails. Grandpa loved it more every time she complained about it. By the time I was born, the car had become part of the family mythology. There were pictures of Dad sitting on the hood in the 70s wearing bell-bottoms. Pictures of Grandpa polishing it in the driveway during the 80s while neighbors watched from their lawns. Pictures of Grandma pretending to hate it while secretly posing beside it during family vacations. Some families passed down jewelry, some passed down watches. In our family, the Mustang was the heirloom. When I was 9, Grandpa started letting me hand him tools while he worked on it in the garage. I couldn't tell a wrench from a screwdriver back then, but he never made me feel stupid for asking questions. He explained everything: carburetors, spark plugs, brake lines, engine timing. By 12, I could change oil by myself. By 14, I could rebuild the carburetor with supervision. By 16, I was driving it around empty parking lots, while Grandpa laughed every time I stalled. "Cars forgive mistakes quicker than people do," he told me once, while I sat fighting with the clutch. "That's why I like them better sometimes." Then Sandra arrived. Dad married her when I was 17, and she arrived in our lives like someone rearranging furniture in a house she didn't build. At first, it was little things. Grandma's paintings disappeared from walls because they looked old-fashioned. Grandpa's fishing trophies moved into boxes because they created clutter. Family traditions quietly vanished one by one, until even Christmas felt like visiting strangers in your own memories. Sandra brought Lily with her. Lily was 14 then. She wasn't cruel exactly. Cruel requires effort. Lily preferred convenience. If someone else worked harder, she deserved the reward, because life was unfair, and why fight unfairness when you could benefit from it instead? Grandpa saw through both of them immediately. He was polite because that was who he was, but polite and fooled aren't the same thing. One summer afternoon, I found him sitting in the garage staring at the Mustang while Sandra argued with Dad inside the house about replacing it with an SUV. Classic cars are money pits, she'd said loudly enough for the neighborhood to hear. Grandpa waited until the shouting stopped before speaking. Promise me something, kiddo? What? Never let anyone convince you that sentimental things don't matter. He rested his hand on the hood. People who say that usually mean your sentimental things don't matter, while theirs somehow still do. I didn't understand the warning then. I understood it now. The next morning, my phone rang again while I was getting coffee downstairs. This time it was Tyler. I answered mostly because he was the only person in the family who'd looked embarrassed on my behalf at dinner. Emma, where are you? Pennsylvania. Silence. You actually left. That was generally the direction of travel, yes. He laughed nervously. Sandra is losing her mind. Interesting. She's saying you stole the car. I nearly dropped my coffee. The car that's legally registered in my name? That's the one. I leaned against the wall beside the elevator. How exactly did I steal my own car? Details don't seem important to her right now. I smiled for the first time in 2 days. How did she even find out? Because Lily drove over to Grandpa's house this morning with a friend to show it off and the garage was empty. I closed my eyes and pictured it perfectly. Lily walking up the driveway smiling. Sandra carrying her phone ready for more pictures. The garage door opening. Empty space where the Mustang should have been. Confusion first, then panic, then anger. What happened next? I asked. Tyler laughed harder this time. Apparently Sandra called the police before checking ownership records. You're kidding? Nope. Officer looked up the title and informed her that the vehicle belonged to one Emma Carter of Chicago, Illinois. I stared out the hotel window at snow falling over the parking lot. Grandpa would have loved that story. Dad called me afterward, Tyler said quietly. He sounded shaken. Good. Sandra told everyone Grandpa intended the car for Lily because she was younger and needed it more. Funny, the lawyer somehow missed that part during the reading of the will. Tyler sighed. People are talking, Emma. About what? About why Sandra thought she could give away property that wasn't hers. I nodded slowly. There it was. The real problem wasn't the car anymore. It was the question. Once people started asking questions, families like ours got nervous. Very nervous. Because questions lead to answers, and answers have a habit of ruining carefully constructed stories. That afternoon, Dad finally reached me. I answered because eventually you run out of reasons not to. Emma, his voice sounded tired. Older somehow. Where is the car? Sold. Silence. You sold your grandfather's car? No, Dad. I sold my grandfather's car that he left to me after your wife gave it away without asking me. His breathing changed slightly. Sandra made a mistake. Sandra announced ownership transfer over Christmas ham and sweet potatoes. She thought, that's the problem, Dad. Nobody ever asked what I thought. He didn't speak for several seconds. Your grandfather would have wanted the family to stay together. I looked out at the snow-covered highway outside the hotel. Grandpa specifically warned me people would get funny when inheritance showed up. More silence. Then quietly he asked, did he really say that? 3 weeks before he died, Dad exhaled slowly. Sandra is upset. I laughed. Actually laughed. Dad, she tried to gift my inheritance to someone else, and somehow she's the victim in this story. He had no answer for that because there wasn't one. We stayed silent together for a while before he finally spoke again. Where are you going? I looked at the highway stretching west beyond the hotel parking lot. I thought about Chicago, about work waiting for me, about apartments and meetings and coffee shops, and people who never once tried to redistribute my life because someone else wanted it more. Away for a little while, I said. I need to think. Will you come back? I thought about Christmas dinner, about the red bow, about Grandpa's empty garage, about smiling while everyone mistook silence for surrender. Eventually, I said honestly, but not until people remember the difference between family and ownership. After we hung up, I went back to my room and opened my laptop. The wire transfer from the sale had already arrived. $72,000 sitting quietly in my account. I stared at the number for a long time. Then I opened a new savings account and named it after the only person in the story who never treated me like I owed him something. The account name was simple, Grandpa's Garage. I stayed in Pittsburgh for 3 days, not because I had to, because I wanted the silence. The kind of silence you only find in hotel rooms after Christmas, when everyone else is driving home with leftovers and gift bags, and family arguments packed into the trunk beside the luggage. My phone vibrated constantly on the nightstand beside me. Dad called twice more. Sandra called 6 times. Lily called once and then switched to text messages when I stopped answering. The messages started angry, then confused, then angry again. How could you do this? You embarrassed us. That car was supposed to stay in the family. I stared at that last message for a long time. Supposed to stay in the family. Funny sentence coming from the people who tried to take it from family in the first place. I never replied. On the 4th day, I drove back to Chicago. The city looked gray and exhausted under December clouds. People hurried along sidewalks carrying coffee cups and grocery bags, while traffic crawled through slush-covered streets. Nobody there knew about Christmas dinner. Nobody knew about the Mustang. Nobody cared. It felt wonderful. My apartment overlooked the river, small but comfortable. The kind of place you earn yourself one paycheck at a time. I unpacked my suitcase, watered the plant I'd forgotten before leaving, and tried very hard not to think about Ohio. That lasted until 8 o'clock, when my phone rang again. Aunt Rebecca. I answered immediately. Honey, she said before I could speak. Are you all right? It was such a simple question that I almost cried hearing it. Nobody else had asked if I was all right. They wanted explanations, justifications, apologies. Aunt Rebecca wanted to know if I was okay. I'm fine. That's not what I asked. I smiled despite myself. I'm getting there. She was quiet for a moment. Your grandfather would have been proud of you. That surprised me. For selling the car? For refusing to let people rewrite reality. I sat down on the couch beside the window. Snow drifted past outside in lazy spirals. Sandra called me yesterday, Aunt Rebecca continued. She said you acted vindictively. Interesting choice of words. I thought so too. Her voice softened. Then she told me Lily had already ordered custom seat covers for the Mustang, and I realized your stepmother had somehow skipped over the part where ownership usually comes before accessories. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped the phone. Oh my God, she actually ordered them? Pink stitching apparently. Grandpa would have climbed out of his grave just to object. We talked for almost an hour. About Grandpa mostly. About fishing trips and birthdays, and the way he always carried peppermints in his shirt pocket. Before hanging up, she said something that stayed with me. People don't get angry when they lose something that was never theirs. Emma, they get angry when they lose access to something they already decided belonged to them. That explains Sandra perfectly. The next week, the story spread through the family exactly the way stories always do in small towns. First came confusion, then sides formed, then details changed depending on who told it. According to Sandra, I had stolen the car out of spite. According to Lily, I had waited until she emotionally connected with it before taking it away. According to one cousin, I had sold it to a collector in California for $200,000 and disappeared to Europe. Honestly, that version was more interesting than the truth. Then the lawyer got involved. Apparently Sandra had actually contacted him hoping there was some mistake in the paperwork. There wasn't. Grandpa had been painfully specific. The vehicle, all related documentation, and all ownership rights transfer solely to my granddaughter Emma Grace Carter. No conditions, no shared ownership. No family approval process. Just me. The lawyer apparently asked Sandra why she thought the vehicle belonged to Lily in the first place. Nobody enjoyed answering that question. New Year's Eve arrived cold and clear. I ordered Chinese food and watched fireworks from my window, while Chicago exploded in color around me. My phone buzzed once just after midnight, a text from Dad. Happy New Year, kiddo. I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. Happy New Year, Dad. I hope next year is kinder to all of us. He never responded. January came. Work returned. Meetings. Deadlines. Coffee that tasted vaguely like burnt cardboard. Slowly the story began moving further away from the center of my life, even if it stayed firmly at the center of everyone else's back in Ohio. Then one Saturday morning my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Hello? Emma? The voice was hesitant. Familiar. Lily. I almost didn't recognize it without the confidence. Hi, Lily. Silence. I wanted to ask you something. Okay. Another pause. Did Grandpa really leave the car to you because of the hospital visits? That caught me off guard. What do you mean? Sandra said he only gave it to you because you manipulated him while he was sick. There it was. The new version of the story. When facts become inconvenient, people often invent motives instead. Lily, I said carefully, how many times did you visit Grandpa after his diagnosis? Silence answered first. Once. How many times did Sandra visit? Twice. I visited 11 times. Another silence. Softer this time. He asked about you during every single visit. I continued gently. He wanted to know how college was going, whether you were happy, whether you still liked photography. He loved you, Lily. She sniffed quietly on the other end of the line. Then why didn't he leave it to me? I looked out the window toward the frozen river below. Because loving someone and trusting someone with something important aren't always the same thing. She didn't speak for several seconds. Did you really sell it for $72,000? I laughed quietly. Family gossip works fast. Sandra thought maybe you lied about selling it and were keeping it somewhere. No, it's gone. Do you miss it? That question surprised me more than anything else she'd said. I thought about Grandpa's garage, about summer evenings, about oil stains on concrete floors, about that tiny scratch beside the headlight. Every day, I admitted. Then why sell it? I closed my eyes, because if I kept it, your mother would spend the next 20 years trying to take it from me. Lily didn't argue because we both knew I was right. Before hanging up, she said something I never expected to hear from her. I'm sorry about Christmas dinner. It wasn't a perfect apology. It wasn't even a complete one. But it was real. Sometimes that's enough to start with. After the call ended, I sat by the window, watching snow drift over Chicago rooftops, and wondered if Grandpa somehow knew all of this would happen. Maybe that's why he warned me. Maybe that's why he transferred everything so carefully. Maybe old men who spend their lives fixing engines get very good at hearing problems long before the rest of us notice the sound. 2 weeks later, a package arrived at my apartment. No return address. Inside was a small leather keychain attached to an old brass key. The spare key to the Mustang. Grandpa had owned two. I kept one after the sale. I thought the other had disappeared years ago. Folded beside it was a note written in my father's handwriting. Your grandfather would have wanted you to have both. I sat there holding the key for a very long time. It wasn't an apology. My father wasn't good at apologies. But for the first time since Christmas dinner, it felt like maybe someone in Ohio was finally beginning to understand what had actually been lost. February arrived with freezing rain and gray skies that made Chicago feel like someone had forgotten to turn the lights on. Work kept me busy enough during the day, but nights were harder. Nights leave room for memories to sit beside you, whether you invite them or not. Sometimes I would catch myself opening my phone to send Grandpa a picture of something funny, before remembering there wasn't a number to send it to anymore. Grief does that. It turns habits into little heartbreaks you keep discovering over and over again. By March, the calls from Ohio had almost stopped completely. Sandra hadn't tried reaching me since New Year's. Lily sent the occasional message about photography classes or work at the bookstore downtown. Dad stayed somewhere in between. A text every few weeks. A birthday message, a picture of the first flowers blooming outside the house in April, with no explanation attached. It wasn't reconciliation. It was weather reporting with emotional subtext. Then Aunt Rebecca called one Sunday afternoon, while I was assembling a bookshelf that claimed it required 2 people, and was proving itself correct. Your father sold the hardware store. I nearly dropped the screwdriver. What? Not the building, just the business. I sat down on the floor surrounded by screws and wooden panels. Andrew's hardware had existed longer than my father had been alive. Longer than I had been alive. Longer than most marriages in Ross County. Why? Business has been down for years, apparently. She hesitated. Longer than anyone realized. Suddenly, the requests for money over the years rearranged themselves inside my head. The roof, the renovation, the insurance payments, the taxes. They hadn't been occasional emergencies. They had been life support. Sandra isn't taking it well, Aunt Rebecca continued. Your father isn't either. I stared at the unfinished bookshelf in front of me. Grandpa used to joke that hardware stores never die. They just slowly turn into coffee shops run by people with beards and opinions about muffins. Where's Dad working now? Maintenance supervisor at the high school. I nodded slowly. Honest work. Different work. Smaller work. Work without ownership attached to it. A week later, Dad called me himself. You heard about the store. It wasn't a question. Rebecca told me. Silence settled between us for a moment. I thought I'd feel angry, he admitted. Instead, I mostly feel tired. That was the most honest thing I'd heard him say in years. Grandpa would have hated seeing it close. Maybe, he cleared his throat, Or maybe he would have asked why I spent so many years trying to save a business that stopped saving me a long time ago. That sounded more like Grandpa than Dad. Maybe grief changes people. Maybe humiliation does. Maybe losing things forces you to figure out which parts of yourself were attached to them in the first place. "How's Sandra?" I asked carefully. He laughed once without humor. "Still angry at you mostly. For selling my own car? For changing the story she wanted to tell." There it was again. Stories. Families survive on stories almost as much as they survive on food. The hard-working father, the difficult daughter, the grateful child, the selfish sibling. Everyone gets assigned a role, and heaven help the person who changes scripts halfway through the performance. And Lily? Another pause. "She's moving to Columbus next month." That surprised me. "For work?" "Photography school." I smiled despite myself. Grandpa had always loved her photographs of old buildings and empty streets. He used to tape them on the garage wall beside the workbench. Good for her. Dad hesitated. "She paid the deposit herself." Small sentence, big meaning. After we hung up, I stood by the window watching rain run down the glass in crooked lines. Maybe people could change after all. Slowly. Unevenly. But maybe. In June, I took a week off work and drove to Ohio for the first time since Christmas. Not to see family. To visit Grandpa's grave. The cemetery sat on a hill outside town overlooking fields that stretched forever under the summer sun. I brought flowers and a folding chair, because Grandpa hated visitors who stood around looking uncomfortable. "If you're going to visit me one day," he'd once joked, "bring a chair and a story." I sat beside the headstone for almost an hour, told him about work, about Chicago, about the bookshelf that nearly defeated me in February, about the account named Grandpa's Garage that had quietly grown every month since January. Then I told him about the Mustang, the sale price, the Christmas dinner, the red bow, the silence afterward, the strange little earthquakes families create when nobody tells the truth for too long. Wind moved through the trees above me. Somewhere nearby, birds argued about something important in bird language. "You were right, by the way," I said finally. People got funny when inheritance showed up. The wind answered by doing absolutely nothing useful. Typical Grandpa behavior, honestly. When I stood to leave, I noticed someone had placed fresh flowers beside his grave already. White lilies. Dad's favorite flowers. For a long moment, I just stood there looking at them. Maybe grief had been visiting him too. Maybe regret had. Maybe both. I was halfway back to my car when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around and froze. Dad stood near the entrance, holding his hands awkwardly in his jacket pockets like a teenager who wasn't sure whether he'd arrived at the wrong party. "Rebecca told me you might come today." I nodded. I almost didn't. He looked toward Grandpa's headstone for a long moment. "He would have liked your account name." I blinked. "How did you know about that?" He smiled sadly. "Lily told me. She said you named your savings account Grandpa's Garage." We stood there in the summer heat, surrounded by silence and old stones, and things neither of us knew how to say properly. Finally, Dad looked at me. Really looked at me. I should have stopped her at Christmas. Not an excuse. Not a justification. Not weather reporting. An actual sentence with ownership attached to it. I swallowed hard. "Yeah," I said quietly. "You should have." He nodded once, accepted it, didn't argue, didn't defend himself. Sometimes accountability sounds less like an apology and more like refusing to run away from the truth. We stood there another minute before he spoke again. "I miss him." I looked back toward the headstone on the hill. "Me too." Then, for the first time since Christmas dinner, my father stepped forward and hugged me. Brief, awkward, slightly confused by its own existence. But real. When he stepped back, his eyes were wet. Mine probably were too. "Cars remember who loves them," he said quietly. I laughed through the tears. "Yeah," he smiled a little. "People probably do too." For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he headed toward his truck, and I headed toward mine. Halfway across the parking lot, I turned back. "Dad." He looked up. "Tell Sandra I'm not angry anymore." He frowned slightly. "Are you sure?" I thought about the Mustang, about Grandpa, about Christmas dinner, about all the months in between. "Anger is expensive," I said, "and I've already paid enough." He nodded slowly, as if memorizing the sentence for later. Then we drove away in opposite directions beneath the same summer sky. Summer became fall almost without asking permission. Chicago traded green for gold, and then gold for brown, while life slowly settled into something that resembled normal again. The calls from Ohio became less frequent. The guilt became quieter. Even the memories started losing their sharp edges. Not disappearing, just becoming easier to carry. Then October arrived. Exactly 1 year after Grandpa's funeral. Exactly 10 months after Christmas dinner. Exactly long enough for everyone to start pretending the story had ended. It hadn't. Stories like ours rarely end when people think they do. They end when people finally become who the story was trying to turn them into all along. I was leaving work one Thursday evening when my phone rang. Lily. I answered while waiting for the elevator. Hey. Hi. Her voice sounded different again. Older somehow. More certain. You busy? Just leaving the office. Can I ask you something weird? I laughed. Those are usually the interesting questions. She was quiet for a second. Would you want to come to Columbus this weekend? The elevator doors opened in front of me. I didn't move. Why? Because I have something to show you. Saturday morning, I drove 2 hours south under gray skies that promised rain but never quite delivered. Lily met me outside a small brick building near campus, carrying a camera bag, over one shoulder and coffee in both hands. She looked different. Not physically exactly, more like someone who had recently discovered they were allowed to become themselves. You cut your hair, she smiled. Sandra hated it. Then it's probably a good haircut. She laughed and handed me a coffee. We walked 3 blocks before stopping outside a small photography gallery. Through the front window, I could see framed pictures hanging along white walls inside, empty streets, bridges, sunsets, old buildings. You have an exhibition? She nodded nervously. Small one. We stepped inside. 27 photographs lined the walls. They were incredible. Not good for a student. Not good for her age, just incredible. One picture stopped me immediately. Grandpa's garage. Late afternoon sunlight pouring through dusty windows onto the workbench. Tools hanging on the wall exactly where he'd left them. The empty space where the Mustang once sat. The title underneath simply read Legacy. I stared at it for a long time. When did you take this? I asked quietly. 3 days after you sold the car. I looked at her. Why? She adjusted the camera strap on her shoulder. Because I realized I wasn't angry you sold it. She swallowed. I was angry because I knew Grandpa had been right to leave it to you, and I hated admitting that. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. Sometimes silence is respectful instead of defensive. This was one of those times. Mom still thinks you stole something from me, Lily continued. But that's not true. She looked toward the photograph. You just refused to let someone steal something from you first. Outside, rain finally started falling against the windows in soft, steady rhythms. We stood there together, looking at the photograph of an empty garage, and somehow it felt full anyway. Dad came to visit last month, she said suddenly. In Columbus? She nodded. He brought me lunch and spent 20 minutes trying to figure out how parking meters work. I laughed. That sounds like Dad. He talks about Grandpa a lot now. Her expression softened. More than he ever used to. I thought about the cemetery, about the flowers, about the hug. Maybe grief had finally forced him to look backward long enough to understand what he'd inherited and what he wanted to stop passing forward. Before I drove back to Chicago that evening, Lily handed me a small envelope. Open it later. I waited until I reached home. Inside was a photograph from the gallery. Grandpa standing beside the Mustang in his driveway sometime in the late 90s. One hand resting on the roof. Smile crooked beneath his baseball cap. On the back she had written a single sentence. Cars remember who loves them. I put the photograph on my desk beside the spare key Dad had mailed me months earlier. Then I opened my laptop and logged into the account named Grandpa's Garage. The balance had grown steadily all year. Quietly, patiently. No emergencies draining it away. No guilt attached to it. Just growth. Just possibility. I smiled and transferred another $500 into it. Not because I had to, because I wanted to. 2 weeks later, my phone rang while I was making dinner. Dad. Hey, kiddo. Hey, Dad. He hesitated. Sandra wants me to ask something. Here we go, I thought. Okay. Would you come for Christmas this year? I stood quietly in my kitchen, holding the phone against my ear, while pasta boiled behind me. Last Christmas had ended with snow and silence, and a $72,000 wire transfer. Will Sandra be giving away any more of my belongings? He laughed. Actually laughed. The sound surprised both of us. No, I think she's retired from inheritance law. I smiled despite myself. I'll think about it. That's fair. Before hanging up, he cleared his throat. Emma? Yeah? Thank you for coming to see Grandpa that day. I looked toward the photograph sitting on my desk across the room. I think he was the one visiting us. Dad was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he said softly. Maybe he was. That December, I drove back to Ohio with snow falling across the highway, exactly the way it had the year before. The difference was that this time, I wasn't carrying anger with me. Just memories. And maybe that was enough. Maybe healing doesn't happen when everyone apologizes perfectly and says exactly the right thing. Maybe sometimes healing begins when people simply stop pretending the wrong story was true. The house on Vine Street looked smaller than I remembered when I pulled into the driveway. Older, too. Dad opened the front door before I reached it. For a moment we just stood there looking at each other. Then he smiled. Welcome home, kiddo. Inside I could hear Christmas music playing softly from the kitchen. I could smell cinnamon and turkey and coffee. For the first time in a very long time, none of it felt heavy. Sandra appeared in the doorway holding a dish towel in both hands like a peace treaty she wasn't sure how to present. Emma, she said quietly. There were 1,000 things she could have said next. Most of them wouldn't have mattered. She chose the only one that did. I was wrong. No explanation, no defense. No conditions attached. Just 4 words. Sometimes 4 words are enough to move mountains. I nodded once. I know. Then she stepped aside and let me in. Christmas dinner felt strangely normal that year. Not perfectly normal. Families like ours don't repair themselves in a single season. But quieter. Softer around the edges somehow. Dad carved the turkey. Sandra asked if anyone wanted more potatoes instead of assigning ownership of inherited vehicles. Lily complained about Columbus parking prices and showed everyone pictures from her latest photography project. Nobody mentioned the Mustang. Nobody mentioned the red bow. Nobody mentioned the Christmas that split our family into before and after. Sometimes healing starts when people stop poking old wounds just to make sure they still hurt. After dinner, I stepped outside onto the porch with a cup of coffee. Snow drifted down through the streetlights exactly like it had the year before. The neighborhood looked frozen in time. Same houses, same trees, same quiet street stretching into the darkness. The front door opened behind me. Dad stepped onto the porch carrying his own coffee and stood beside me without speaking for a while. You know, he finally said, your grandfather almost sold that Mustang in 1987. I looked over at him. Really? He nodded. Money was tight. Really tight. The store wasn't doing well, and I needed braces, and your aunt needed surgery, and he had an offer on the car. He smiled faintly. Your grandmother found him sitting in the garage at 2 in the morning staring at it. What happened? Dad laughed quietly. He told her selling it would feel like selling proof that younger versions of themselves existed. I smiled into my coffee. That sounded exactly like Grandpa. Did he keep it because of sentiment? Dad shook his head. No. He kept it because your grandmother reminded him that not everything valuable needs to become useful in order to deserve staying. We stood there listening to the wind move through the trees. After a while, Dad spoke again. I think I forgot that somewhere along the way. I didn't ask what he meant because I already knew. Stores become numbers. Houses become assets. Children become investments. Somewhere between surviving and succeeding people sometimes forget the difference between value and price. I forgot it too for a while, he admitted. Your grandfather knew before I did. He looked over at me. You were right to sell the car. That surprised me more than anything else he'd ever said. Really? He nodded slowly. Because by the time Christmas happened, it wasn't Grandpa's car anymore. He looked toward the snow-covered street. It had become a test. I thought about that for a long moment. Maybe he was right. Maybe selling it wasn't giving up Grandpa's memory. Maybe it was protecting it from becoming something ugly. The front door opened again, and Lily stepped outside holding her camera. Stay there, she said. Both of you. Dad groaned immediately. Absolutely not. Too late. The camera clicked before either of us could move. She checked the screen and smiled. Perfect. I doubt that very much, Dad said. Trust me. She held up the camera for us to see. It was a good picture. Better than good, actually. 2 people standing awkwardly beside each other under Christmas lights, and falling snow trying very hard to figure out how being family worked again. You should print that one, I said. Already planning to. She smiled mischievously. Might even frame it. Dad looked horrified by the concept of wall decorations involving himself. Some things never change. I drove back to Chicago the next morning, while snow covered the highway in white ribbons, stretching toward the horizon. Halfway home, my phone buzzed with a message from Sandra. "Thank you for coming." That was it. No speeches, no explanations, no requests. Just 6 words. I replied with 2. Thank you. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. Forgiveness is bigger than text messages. Bigger than Christmas dinners. Bigger than single conversations. But it was movement, and sometimes movement is enough. Spring arrived early that year. In March, I got promoted to senior manager at the firm. In April, Lily's photography exhibit sold out its final weekend. In May, Dad retired from the high school and started restoring old furniture in his garage, because apparently Andrew's men are physically incapable of not fixing things. Then in June, almost exactly 2 years after Grandpa died, my phone rang while I was sitting on my balcony watching boats move along the river below. "Emma," Dad sounded nervous. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure. Would you come to Ohio next weekend?" "What's happening next weekend?" He hesitated just long enough for me to know this mattered. "I bought something." That was not the sentence I expected. "Okay. I think it's easier if I show you." The following Saturday, I pulled into the driveway on Vine Street and immediately noticed the garage door was open. Dad stood inside beside a car covered by a gray tarp. Sandra stood near the workbench. Lily leaned against the wall holding her camera. "What's this?" I asked. Dad looked suddenly uncomfortable in the way only fathers can look when trying to do something emotional without accidentally becoming emotional in public. He grabbed the tarp and pulled. Underneath sat a 1967 Mustang coupe. Not Grandpa's car. Never Grandpa's car. But beautiful all the same. Deep green paint, chrome trim catching the sunlight, interior half restored, and smelling faintly of leather and sawdust. I stared at it for several seconds. "Dad," he rubbed the back of his neck. "It's not a replacement." "I know, because nothing replaces people." His voice caught slightly. "Or memories." Sandra stepped forward quietly. "But maybe families deserve second chances, even when cars don't get them." Nobody spoke for a moment. Finally, Dad held out a key toward me. "Help me restore it?" I looked at the key, then at the garage, then at the people standing inside it. Not perfect people, not easy people, just people trying very hard to become better than they used to be. Slowly, I took the key. "Only if I get final approval on paint color." Lily laughed. Sandra rolled her eyes. Dad smiled for the first time in what felt like years. "Deal." We spent that summer rebuilding the car one weekend at a time. Oil changes, brake lines, engine work, arguments about carburetors, pizza boxes stacked beside toolboxes. Sometimes healing looks dramatic in movies. In real life, it usually looks like ordinary Saturdays repeated often enough to matter. The account called Grandpa's Garage stayed open the entire time. The money remained untouched, growing quietly in the background, like all good things do when left alone long enough. One afternoon, while tightening bolts beneath the hood, I asked Dad something that had bothered me for years. "Do you think Grandpa knew this would happen?" Dad didn't even look up from the engine. "Absolutely." "Then why leave me the car anyway?" Dad smiled sadly. "Because he wasn't leaving you a car." I looked over at him. He finally looked back. "He was leaving you permission not to become us." The garage went quiet after that, except for tools clicking against metal and summer wind moving through the open door. Years later, when people ask me about the Christmas my stepmother gave away my grandfather's car, I usually tell them the truth. Yes, I sold it before New Year's. Yes, I disappeared. Yes, my family fell apart for a while afterward. But that's not actually what the story was about. The story was about what happens when people confuse love with ownership for so long that they forget there was ever a difference. The story was about a grandfather smart enough to see the storm coming and kind enough to leave me an umbrella anyway. The story was about learning that walking away and giving up are not the same thing. And the story was about discovering that sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't the thing someone leaves you, it's the lesson hidden inside why they left it to you in the first place. The brass key still hangs beside my apartment door. Grandpa's spare key, the one Dad mailed back to me after Christmas. Every time I leave for work, I see it there. Small, ordinary, quiet. A reminder that some things don't belong to us because we paid for them, or earned them, or won them. Some things belong to us because someone who loved us trusted us to carry them forward. Cars remember who loves them. People probably do too.